I recently reviewed the Sega Genesis Mini 2 that was released on October 27th. I found it to be loaded with some really fantastic titles, and I really appreciated a lot of the cool extras that were thrown in. You got some new modes in games that were 30 years old, and a number of new arcade conversions that never appeared during the console's retail presence. I was indeed let down by the lack of Sega CD titles that I really felt should have been there, but overall it was a fun product that offered some really good games. I also recently got my hands on the Japanese version of this product, which goes by that region's branding, the Mega Drive Mini 2. As you probably have heard by now, this version of the Mini had a number of differences in its game library. That prompted me to have a look at it and see if it was worth covering for the channel. After about a week messing around with it, I've decided to do a short video explaining the differences you'll see between this and its Western counterparts. While the two are extremely similar in regards to feature set, I found this to have a number of interesting distinctions that sort of give it a personality all its own. Let's go ahead and fire this thing up and see what it's got going on. As you'd expect, the interface is virtually identical to the Genesis Mini 2. By default, everything on this model comes in Japanese with the Japanese cover art for each title. Switch the language to English and you get the US Mini 2 front end with the US cover art where applicable. If the game does not have an English edition, it retains the Japanese cover art. And no, before you get your hopes up, both the Lunar titles and Popful Mail stay in their original Japanese editions no matter the language setting. Fortunately, there are some other cool features tucked away in many of the games that are worth mentioning. If you change the language to English, you get the US Genesis version of Romance of the Three Kingdoms 3, Dragon of Destiny. When selecting this title, it gives you a cartridge or Sega CD option. The Sega CD is actually still the Japanese Mega CD release, but the cartridge is the English version. This is actually a good game for sim fans, and I do recommend you give it a try. Robo Alesta is in every version of the Mini 2, but the Japanese edition has both the Mega CD and Sega CD versions selectable from the menu without having to change the language. This was a deliberate addition because the two games share some notable differences. The difficulty scales faster in the Western release, and there are additional voice acting segments in the Japanese version. Not a big deal, but it's a nice option that's built right into the front end. All of the other touches that were in the Genesis Mini 2 are still here as well. Sonic CD has the different soundtracks you can choose. Thunder Force 4 still has its high-speed mode you can enable. Truxton still has the original and arcade-style sound options. Space Harrier 2 comes with Space Harrier 1 and a new sprite scaling feature. This will delight many of you, but I find the sprite flicker to be a real eyesore. There are some deflicker modes hidden in the options, but they are not magic bullets that cure the problem. In fact, one of the options outright breaks the game entirely by adding debilitating slowdown during most of the boss encounters. But the real meat of the content here are the games that did not appear on the Western Mini 2 variants. The library differences in the Japanese release cover some interesting choices. Though they are Japanese editions, a few of them are still playable, with a handful even having their Western Genesis options. Let's talk a bit about each one. Our first title is Magical Tarurutukun, a 1992 action game developed by Game Freak. This one has you controlling a magic user that must navigate various stages using his wand attack, powers that you procure as you play, and the items you pick up and manipulate along the way. The visuals are super colorful, the art and backgrounds look fantastic, and even the animation is a home run. This is not a bad game at all and is completely playable even if you don't understand Japanese. This one is a delight, and I actually wish Sega had kept it on the Western Mini 2. It easily could have replaced Outrunners or Clay Fighter, improving that library incredibly. I was somewhat shocked Sega didn't leave Columns 3 on the US and European Mini too. This is a solid release that supports as many as 5 players at the same time. When turned to the English language, you get the Western version, so all the options and tutorials are in English. If you don't care for puzzlers, this one isn't going to change your mind, but it's a good one if you do. Mega Panel is a Namco-developed game that mixes the likes of Tetris with a moving piece puzzler. Slide the light-colored blocks around to match 3 or more and get rid of them. There is an exercise mode where you learn to play by completing lessons, a pin-up mode where you play to reveal a picture, and there is a 2-player head-to-head mode. There is some Japanese here, but mostly the game is fairly intuitive, and you quickly learn what you must do to play it. I won't call it unique, but it's certainly not a bad entry for this genre. Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water is a Namco-developed adventure game based on the popular anime series. Unfortunately, there's no good news here for those of you that do not speak Japanese. This is extremely story-heavy, and trying to muddle your way through it is gonna be tough. On the bright side, it does have an English fan translation, so if this product ever gets hacked, be sure to add it back in and give it a go. When Sega announced the addition of one of the puzzle and action titles, I knew we were in for some very Japanese-specific choices to follow. This one is composed of mini-games that you can play alone or with up to 4 players. The games are simple, so you can figure out what to do in most of them after just a couple of tries. I found this to be tedious rather quickly, however, and I can't say I found it all that appealing. There is an RPG mode that I can't play because of all the Japanese text, so there may be some hidden depth here that I'm not seeing. It's here if you want to give it a go. Starblade is a polygon on-rail shooter that is based on the arcade of the same name. This one pairs back the enemies to wireframes, but the backgrounds still look good and the challenge is still there if you like shooters. When you switch the language to English, you get the US release, so no worries about a language barrier. It's not going to dethrone the 3DO or PlayStation versions, but it's still an interesting piece of Sega CD history. Hari Manada is perhaps the most interesting game on the Mega Drive Mini 2. It's a fighting game featuring sumo wrestlers. It's based on a Japanese comic book series and does have a story to it. Of course, that story is all in Japanese. The options are in Japanese as well. Find a moves list and this is playable, however. There are techniques to learn and you can change your opponent's momentum and score a ring out, or you can just knock them out the old-fashioned way. The visuals are actually quite nice with huge sprites that are animated really well. Of course, it's not going to give Street Fighter II anything to worry about, but it feels like nothing else on the platform. It's definitely worth a few play sessions, especially with friends. As many of you already know, Popful Mail and both Sega CD Lunar titles, the Silver Star and Eternal Blue, are on the Japanese Mega Drive Mini 2. As I said previously, they remain in Japanese no matter the language settings. It's a bitter pill to swallow, and no matter whose side of the story you choose to sympathize with, the absence of their English translations was a brutal omission. These were absolutely essential Sega CD titles in the West, and should Sega make a Mini 3, they need to solve that licensing issue, or simply not do it at all. The Wonder Mega Collection, as the name implies, came as a bundle with the Wonder Mega system. It's a compilation that has 4 different titles. You get Quiz Scramble, a game that hits you with trivia challenges, Flicky, a port of the arcade original where you must rescue little birds from cats, Pyramid Magic, an action puzzler where you must move around blocks and find keys to gain access to the exit, and finally Paddle Fighter, which is a digital air hockey style contest. The majority of these titles were released via Sega's download service in Japan for the Mega Modem. Flicky and Quiz Scramble would also see cartridge releases. It's not a bad little collection, and all of them are easy to play for non-Japanese speaking gamers outside of Quiz Scramble. That one has a heavy use of Japanese text, since it's basically just a series of questions and answers. Sorcerian, or Sorcerian as I like to call it, is part of Falcom's Dragon Slayer series of games, with this port being handled by Sega themselves. I wish I could tell you that this was playable for non-Japanese reading folks, but it's not at all. There is heavy Japanese text across nearly every screen outside of the gameplay, making this one hell of a slog if you were trying to translate it as you go. Hell, just getting a game started is a chore. It's actually a pretty cool game where you get to create teams of heroes that then have access to various scenarios to conquer. Awesome for those that can read the language, not so much for the rest of us. You also get King Colossus on the Mega Drive Mini 2. I recently played through the English fan translation and loved it. It's a top-down RPG with lots of exploration, so if you enjoyed something like Zelda, this should appeal to you as well. As it stands on the Mega Drive Mini 2, it has the same issue as Sorcerian, lots of Japanese text to overcome. As I mentioned earlier, setting your language to English will give you the US Genesis release of Romance of the Three Kingdoms 3. Be aware, however, that the Sega CD option will still give you the Japanese Mega CD edition. That version was never translated to English, so you'll need to stick with the cartridge version to retain the English translation. Shin Megami Tensei was a huge addition to the product given the eventual popularity of the series. Of course, this Japanese Mega CD version was never translated officially to English, so you get a game absolutely steeped in Japanese text. It's difficult to play for folks that don't understand the language, but a guide could be helpful if you're dedicated. Hopefully we'll see a Sega CD fan translation someday. Tenka Fubu is a strategy simulation that was really popular in Japan. This was done by Game Arts, the company that turned out the Lunar series, so you know it's gotta be quality. As you'd expect, there was no US Sega CD translation, so the text is gonna be a tough one to get through. This one is basically for speakers and readers of Japanese only. Gambler School Katayama Matsuyuki Mahjong Dojo was a Game Arts published Mahjong game originally released in 1990. This has a story to it that's of course in Japanese, but the actual gameplay model is fairly easy to follow. You won't be able to get the most out of it, but it's here if you enjoy Mahjong. Captain Tsubasa is a very cinematic soccer game with a heavy focus on story and characters. Again, no English translation, so this one is going to be a tough one for many of you. It has great graphics though, and it is possible to meander through a game with some success. Fans of the sport will likely enjoy it enough to learn the base gameplay model. For the rest of you, it's not going to hold a lot of interest. Silky Lip is an adventure game in the Japanese tradition of young schoolgirls fighting bad guys in their spare time. There are some incredible cinematics here, but I have no clue what the heck is happening. Like most of these, there is no English translation, so the voice and text is extremely difficult to follow. Star Cruiser is an action-adventure that uses a few different graphics modes and some nifty three-dimensional effects. There's polygon ships, first-person shooting segments, and lots of choices to be made on where to go and what to do. There is no official Mega Drive English translation, but it does have a fan-created one, so I highly recommend you give it a look. It calls itself a space soap opera, and that is quite the fitting description. The two party quiz games, Mega Q and Sega Q, are updates to the old 1991 version, now with new questions, including a version with nothing but Sega trivia. It would have been really cool to have this in English, but alas, it was not meant to be. As it is, there is not a lot here for most of you. Our last game is Dodge Dampe, a story-heavy dodgeball game with lots of power-ups and drama. Find yourself a guide to help you understand the gameplay, because this is actually really fun. Would have been cool if the story was accessible to English-speaking audiences, but the game itself, particularly its multiplayer, is a blast. Turn the simulation mode on and watch a few games. It'll help you understand the flow a bit better. It will also interest some of you that changing the language to French or Italian will get you the front end of the European Mega Drive Mini 2 and the cover art where it existed. Should the game not have been released in PAL regions, it retains its US or Japanese cover art. Also of note, some of these games have additional languages. Games like Night Trap and Salil come in full French localizations. Not every game gets this treatment, but it's nice to see options available to those in other regions of the globe. That about wraps up our look at the Japanese Mega Drive Mini 2. As someone that doesn't speak or read much Japanese, I wanted to do this episode to share with you some thoughts on whether it's worth owning for someone in the same position. I really like the physical looks of the Japanese version, both because of the colored accents and it's more authentic to the original Japanese region release. As you know, the Western Mini 2 kept the slide switch design despite the original Genesis 2 having a push button. I know it's such a small thing, but when you collect items for their nostalgic value, everything counts. You may also be interested to know that the Sega Genesis Mini 2 has a slightly larger controller than the Mega Drive Mini 2 from Japan. Side by side, you can see a noticeable difference between them. But those are certainly tiny things compared to the game library differences. The Japanese model has numerous games that are not on the Genesis Mini 2, and while some are really unique, many of them come with language barriers that will put many of you off. If you can speak or read Japanese, this is a no-brainer as far as a recommendation, just for the 2 Lunar titles and Popful Mail. But for the rest of you, you will have a lot more to consider. With all these changes and additions to the library, you don't get many of the titles that came on the Western variant. Streets of Rage 3 is missing, Shining Force 2 is missing, Earthworm Jim 2 is missing, Elemental Master, Hellfire, Herzog 2, Golden Axe 2, Ristar, Shadow Dancer, all gone. On the plus side, you still get Western releases of bangers like Shining Force CD, Ranger X, Sylphid, Sonic CD, Phantasy Star 2, and Crusader of Sinti. But with every change and addition comes compromise, so I highly advise considering what's added, what's missing, and what's here is actually playable if you don't understand Japanese. This is especially the case since this is sold out and you are likely going to pay more than its original retail price, which was already on the high side considering it ships with only 1 controller and lacks a power block. For a more in-depth look at some of the other features that this shares with the Genesis Mini 2, I'll throw a link in the description for you. Finally, I want to end this video by taking a moment and acknowledge the passing of Rieko Kodama, Sega art designer, producer, and overall rock star that had a hand in countless Sega releases since 1984. This lady was involved with games like Ninja Princess, Quartet, the Phantasy Star series, Alex Kidd, Altered Beast, Castle of Illusion, Shadow Dancer, Sonic the Hedgehog, Magic Knight Rayearth, Deep Fear, Skies of Arcadia, the Nintendo Switch Sega Ages line, and many others. She passed away in May at a far too young age, and is a huge loss to the Sega community on a whole. She was immortalized in the credits of the Sega Mega Drive Mini 2 here, and had a hand in a number of the titles that are on it. She was the first lady of console RPGs, a pioneer, a visionary, a trailblazer, and none of our journeys with Sega would have been the same without her. My heart goes out to her family and friends. She set a standard that will not soon be forgotten. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.